We are live.
Welcome everyone to Connected Learning TV. This is the first webinar of our July 2015 series titled Learning and Leading in a Connected World with Educator Innovator, National Writing Project, and EdConteXts. If you're watching this, please take a moment to share it with your networks. I'm Joe Dillon. I'm with the Denver Writing Project, and I work here in the Denver area at the Aurora Public Schools. We're thrilled to be speaking with some connected learners who bring their passion for equity to this conversation, so we can discuss the intersection of equity issues and educational change that we experience or see in our various contexts. Because this conversation coincides with the Connected Learning MOOC, or CL-MOOC, we also hope to discuss the equity issues inherent in open online learning, and perhaps unpack the promise we see in open online learning like connected courses or CL-MOOC. So before we get started, I'd just like to say that each week throughout this series on Connected Learning TV, we'll be exploring themes and questions related to CL-MOOC, but we'll also think about how they relate to broader discourses around education and learning, with particular emphases on equity and contextual considerations. So just a note about what CL-MOOC is really quickly. It's a massive open online collaboration that's in its third iteration this summer. And that online professional learning is really geared to get participants making and sharing, working in openly networked channels, and then every week participants are prompted to think about connected learning principles and values as lenses for reflection. So today, I'm here talking with Maha Bali, Chris Rogers, Sam Sharma, and Laura Czerniewicz. Before we dive into our chat, let's go over a couple quick details. To those of you watching live right now, we welcome your comments and questions either via the Twitter hashtags CLMOOC or Connected Learning, or the Q&A feature that you should see within the video player. We'll do our best to address your questions here in the Google Hangout. I'd like to give everyone a chance to quickly introduce themselves and their organization. Chris, do you want to start?
Yeah, hey everybody. Chris Rogers here. I'm in the NWP office, National Writing Project office in Philadelphia. I'm a facilitator as part of CL-MOOC, educator in Philadelphia as a media and technology specialist for Green Street Friends. And other than that, a lot of teacher networks, a lot of community events, and really trying to stay connected to the grassroots and really try to bridge community spaces together here in Philadelphia and sites of learning across the community. So glad to be here and glad to be in conversation with you all.
Hi, this is Sam Sarma. Along with Maha Bali, I'm part of the EdConteXts team, which is attempting to connect educators across contexts and cultures and countries around the world. I am an assistant professor of writing and rhetoric at Stony Brook University, part of the State University of New York system. And I'm interested, fascinated, curious to learn more about the issues of technology and equity in the context of online and open learning spaces and communities and collaboration. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with colleagues here.
And Laura, would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I'm Laura Czerniewicz. I'm from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, so I'm very happy to be here. It's very late at night. I'm the director for the Center for Innovation in Learning and Teaching, which is part of a faculty-type structure which focuses very strongly on higher education development. And it's a particularly interesting university because it's a top-ranked research university with a strong equity history and imperative, very mindful of its place in South Africa. So I'm really happy to be part of this discussion today.
And Laura is also part of EdConteXts, which she forgot to say. I'm Maha Bali. I am an associate professor of practice at the Center for Learning and Teaching of the American University in Cairo. It's also 10 p.m. over here. I think that's the same time it is for Laura. but I don't consider that late at night. That's normal for me. And as Sam said, Sam and I co-founded EdConteXts, and Laura was with us from the very beginning. And also Joe, when Joe started using the hashtag for Techquity, I was there at the beginning of that too. And I know that everyone here in this room is someone who cares about equity and technology, and I hope to talk about other people who have been writing and talking about these issues, and to also address how it applies to people in my side of the world, and with MOOCs and so on. So I'm a great fan of CL-MOOC. This is my second time participating in it. And I think there have been already quite a few equity conversations there, so I hope those come up in the conversation.
Yeah, and I think that gives us just a little bit of background to jump into this conversation about equity. You know, as Maha alluded to, it was about, I think, last October when on Twitter, a few folks I'm connected with on Twitter and I were going back and forth, saying that we needed a hashtag that considerations with EdTech considerations, because I know as a learner and someone who's interested in equity, I was seeing a lot of really compelling research and conversations, but I felt like there was no tag for that. And so in a kind of a funny exchange on Twitter, we sort of narrowed down some hashtags that we'd proposed to this, clunky Techquity that to some degree has stuck. But sometimes since then, people have asked me sort of like to define terms or clarify what it encompasses and what it doesn't. And I think my thinking is instead of trying to narrow like what you might tag in terms of Techquity, it really has provided me a space to think about like what other people see as important equity considerations. So instead of trying to, again, pursue a fine point of any one definition of equity, we could potentially broaden a conversation about what is equity to us. So with that as background, maybe we can start by talking about some equity issues that arise for each of us or are compounded when schools or educational institutions endeavor to keep pace with cultural changes resulting from our increasingly wired world.
So, Joe, do we want to pick some of the questions that we have been sharing, or do we want to make it even more open-ended?
I would leave it to you. I think you're certainly welcome to prompt the group with questions, or we can start by identifying like central equity considerations in our own contexts.
I guess I'll just throw one on the table, see if anybody wants to pick it up or build on it. So the first question that I had when I was trying to come up with a list of questions was, would you say that the rapid emergence of new technologies, everything always new, is producing more vulnerabilities than it is serving and connecting people and communities today? And by vulnerabilities, I'm thinking about, spaces situations where we are not aware of weaknesses, of what we don't know, and how we obscure things because we're excited about one thing and are not ignoring other things, such as access, such as equity.
Yeah, I mean, is this the open floor for now?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, in my work and how I come to think of it, and I love that you pointed out, Sam, about like the idea of like newness, right? And because for me, the problems have never resided within the technology. I think it's important to like remind ourselves of that. The problem has always been socially constructed by us people, and then projected into the technologies that we're using. So when I think about equity, I mean, even in the global context that we're in right now, you talk about like colonialism, imperialism, sort of like structural poverty, capitalism, racism, militarism. All these things are resided. They resided before we go into creating new technologies with these ideas already in our mind. So to me, the real equity work is making those things visible, and opening ourselves to understand how they have influenced why we design and how we think about innovation.
And let me take the ideas that Sam and Chris are just saying and talk about them in a more concrete way and very practical examples of those. So I mean, I like what Joe said at the beginning about expanding our understanding of what an equity issue is. So it could go from people having infrastructure access to technology to culturally not understanding how to use this technology because they don't have the digital literacy, to gender issues, to accessibility issues because they're colorblind or whatever. And so there's, for example, if we think about some MOOCs, there are MOOCs where a lot of what you do with the MOOC involves using video, for example. And that automatically makes it difficult for people who don't have the infrastructure for the video and people who don't have the time to sit and listen and watch a 1-hour video because they're busy people or they're women and they don't have the time for that. There are certain MOOCs that I participated in where you had to sit on a computer and do a lot of things, whereas I'm always on a mobile device because I'm busy taking care of my child or commuting to work, and sitting on a computer means I have to be doing actual work. I can't be doing, extra stuff. And so by doing things like that, you're excluding someone, not because it's impossible necessarily for them to do it, but it's just very difficult. So I think the important thing is being open to those conversations and allowing for different options. Or the technology can be used to exclude, but it can also be used to include in ways that are not possible otherwise. And I don't want to go all out and be angry at technology. I mean, Sam and I wrote an article with 2 parts. One where we were angry at the technology, and one where we were saying, well, but these are the ways you can use it well. And in other ways, the technology actually brings us together, right? And it reduces inequities by allowing all of us right here to be talking together about this, when otherwise we wouldn't have this opportunity. So. Sam, you need to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Related to what Chris was saying earlier, he brought up the issue of power and militarism and all those kinds of problems in the world, and those could be intensified by the power of technologies as well as undermined by the power of technologies. And so what we need to do as educators is to point out when people are all excited about how they're going to change the world with these new technologies, how they're going to make education accessible, how they're going to make knowledge transparent, open, and so forth. We've got to really challenge where their claims, their bombastic, often megalomaniac claims about changing the world in a positive way is only driven by the same kinds of power and domination that do not really think about issues of access and issues of equity for people around the world. So I think here's an interesting role that we can play as educators by highlighting some of the pitfalls in spite of the great affordances of technology.
I'm really interested in the fact that you spoke about both the pluses and the minuses, Maha. I think there's a really interesting example that's been happening at my university. I don't know if you know about the Rhodes Must Fall hashtag and the Rhodes Must Fall movement, but the students at my university have been very, very active recently, and the Rhodes Must Fall hashtag rose in response to the removal of a very prominent statue of Cecil John Rhodes, which stood right at the front of the university and became the epitome and the exemplification of a whole range of concerns to do with the curriculum, to do with issues of equity, to do with racism, to do with a number of concerns. What was particularly interesting about this was the fact that it spread to student movements across the world on social media. So the first week that we ran our first MOOC, which was a really big deal for us, we had about 1,000 tweets on Twitter. But in the first weeks of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, there were 500,000 tweets with the Rhodes Must Fall hashtag. So it was an incredibly interesting example of equity issues being taken online across student movements across the world.
Can you spell out the hashtag, Laura?
Rhodes Must Fall. So Cecil John Rhodes, R-H-O-D-E-S, must fall.
Yes, I mean, and Laura, what a connection, right? I did read one article about that. I think it's from the website. It's called in a funny way, Africa is a country. It's trying to really kind of build this out.
Yeah,
And I saw that, right? And you talk about like these waves and these currents, right? And in the United States right now, right? We just had, well, a mass murder a number of weeks ago in Charleston. And then that led to really point ourselves at the Confederate flag that was used as a, sort of like a symbol of Southern slave states. And that's been a movement, right? It was a whole movement that we had about take down the flag, right? And we talk about these symbols, and when we talk about like the pluses and minuses, how the ability of technologies to bring us together and to sort of like be beyond those borders and boundaries that have been, you know, artificially created, you know, over time. So that's awesome. That's an awesome connection. I'm glad I got to hear that
Chris,
story.
have you seen how the Charleston issues and the Confederate flag issues have featured on the media, and if they have any connection to student activism and things like that in our part of the world?
Definitely. I think you said earlier, Sam, about how technology can be used to undermine. And I know a lot of people like to. I know Maha's in Egypt. They really like to point to like the Arab Spring as like this moment of where Twitter and Facebook and these technologies. But you know, also we had to balance that with there's a feeling that resides within the people that came to those technologies. It's not something that the technology just created on its own. So I think it's important to note that, like, definitely, Sam, like there's millions of us that all are going through the same things, right? Whether by some sort of form of oppression or another. And I think by sharing our stories, which technologies allow us to do in ways that can sort of go across these different sort of like boundaries and silos, right? And so we're able to collaborate better. We can see how we're all connected. And I think that feeling is really important. There's also, but there's a, I don't know. I'm talking too much. I'm trying to find out where I'm going with it. So I'm gonna go on mute for a second and think about it. Maybe I'll come back with it later. But somebody would love to take it.
So it's great that you mentioned the Arab Spring, because I was just about to mention this and to compare this to surveillance and algorithms, right? So the Arab Spring is an example of how young people were able to communicate in you know, subversive ways, because the government and older people were not on Twitter and not so much on Facebook, right? But on the other hand, it became a space now where anything you write on the internet can be used against you, and not in a funny way. Like, I think when people in the US talk about their anger at surveillance, they have no idea what we're talking about. We're talking about imprisonment and torture, and I just said that on a Google Hangout, and somebody's going to see that I've said that, you know? And it's a huge issue. And then the other side of that is also the ways in which these media control what we see. So I'm in the same continent as Laura, and I hadn't heard of Rhodes Must Fall, but my Twitter timeline is full of people in the US who are liberals. And I was reading about the Confederate flag. I watch US TV on satellite, but I don't watch South African TV on satellite. I'm aware of what's happening in the Arab world, but I don't know what else is happening anywhere else in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is like almost another planet for me, whereas the US feels much closer. And so the issues of the Confederate flag for me were much closer to me than they shouldn't be, but they were. You know what I mean?
That's so interesting.
That's another interesting.
It's interesting how we just develop terms of global conversation, and on whose terms those terms are created. Yeah, whose social discourses become interesting, relevant, important. I guess technology facilitates that process as well as us who are agents using the technology. Can I ask a second question then? We have a bunch here. How do the challenges then, because I wanted to ask this question at this point because Chris brought that up and Maha is actually bringing that up again. How do the challenges compare? The challenges of Techquity, educational and technological equity, compare within national/geopolitical borders and across those contexts? What are the unique challenges in our different contexts? I'm interested because we are all from different parts of the world right in this conversation, and I'm thinking, what are some of those barriers that may be unique and different in different places? Do we want to delve a little deeper into that question?
I think I might.
Yeah, please start. Yep.
So in my context, I work in a public education K-12 context, and I work as a technology coordinator. And so, and many of the schools we work with are urban and have socioeconomic challenges, and students face various risk factors. And we represent, our schools often see influxes of refugees, etc. And so, what I see in terms of some of the equity issues that arise here is really, it's really related to the learning needs of the educators who serve this diverse community that are faced with all these risk factors. And so often some of the things that bother me is like the vendor-driven discourse around educational technology that can often be the first message they hear. And to me, it leads to the fetishization of the tools and the apps, and we can sometimes pre-service teachers or teachers new to the profession can think that these tools themselves will do something, right? And so I think that's a challenge to equity, is the vendor message that so often the app is the solution. But I also have to say that I've really been buoyed and encouraged by how quickly teachers gravitate and how much they say this concept of Techquity resonates with them. So even a teacher who will be self-deprecating about I'm so far behind in technology, I need help, they will articulate equity issues in their classroom right away about access, about the kinds of things students are engaged in online, like are they skill and drill, or are students engaged in complex problems. So I see the challenges, because with all these stakeholders with such huge learning needs, there's an opportunity for vendors to come in and hijack that conversation that is better spent on equity.
How about Laura was going to say something, I think.
Yeah, that was so interesting. The role of vendors and the predominance that they have in your context. I don't think we see that in quite the same way here. But I think there's someone called Thurborn who talks about different types of inequality, and I have found that really helpful, because he differentiates between resource inequality and what he calls existential inequality. And I think that very often the focus is on the resource inequalities, which are not insignificant, and certainly we can talk about those. Those are really serious. But I think that what we've seen really emerge in our context lately through these kinds of student movements have actually been around what one would call existential inequalities. And that's about sense of autonomy, about dignity, about freedom. And the interesting thing about, I think, the online space and the move to online courses and online provision is that it moves from the local to the global. And so for those of us in Africa, we are mindful of being markets, and we are mindful of being on the receiving end of new courses and new possibilities, either I'm talking about formal and informal, through traditional credit-bearing courses and through MOOCs. And the kind of content that's made available, the kind of curricula, the kind of knowledge that's being shared with us is often on a kind of broadcast model. And I think that there's a strong push to decolonize the curriculum, which is linked to what's going on in that online space and how people are not seeing themselves represented and not seeing themselves having agency.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's one of the reasons we founded EdConteXts, right? Is to provide room for those voices that are not normally heard, and
exactly.
Both open up the conversation for people like us with each other, but also for people from the West to listen to us on our terms, And again, one of the things that Sam and I were talking about is that it's never enough for someone to speak about others who are different than themselves. You need to create room for others to speak for themselves on their own terms, in whatever way they want to. And in some ways, I guess having Sam and me co-facilitating this whole series for this month is one way of anti-colonial practice, you know, having us, giving us the space to choose how we want to handle this, and we're including other people from EdConteXts like Laura, and then also intersecting with CL MOOC so that we have a wider audience also to listen to what we have to say. That in itself is helpful. But again, we're using English, which is not my first language, Sam's first language. We're using the technology of the West that people are used to using. You know, I mean, there's all of these issues that still in some ways on our own turf. For Laura and me, it's 10 at night, so of course our intellectual concentration is probably not the same as people for whom it's like.
And your line is cutting up a little bit for me too, because.
Okay. I'll move over to someone else. I'll head over to someone else.
No, it's good.
I feel like the point you made though is a beautiful one. Like when I was thinking about what like just making the connection for me is like when Joe talks about the vendors, right? It's you know, it's something about like how political economy works, that the control of the conversation, right? And who's controlling? Sam talked about this too. Like who's controlling the conversation? And it's about like putting those borders, those barriers to entry, so that we don't connect. That I have to continue to come back to the vendors, right? Instead of being able to talk amongst other people. And I think as we move into this global, it should be global conversations, right? But for the most part, if we look at like the you got these things like with like the G20 summits or whatever, where we have the people at the top who are coming together and having these conversations. They have translators and this, that, and the third. But when at a time do we sort of like in a very positive sense, the lay people are having these talks, are sharing our issues, are sharing our concerns, are sharing our critiques, are sharing the things that happen in our country, are sharing the things that you know, our fears of each other as well. We talk about these existential threats. So yeah, I mean, I'm trying to pick up on what you said, and I hope people will recognize it then. And let's keep going in the conversation. Sam, you still on mute? Sorry.
Keep forgetting. I think you kind of wonderfully magnified what Laura was saying, but the two terms that Laura introduced was amazing, powerful. Because on the one hand is the resource and the material, the other one is the human and the existence. Because if you yes, we really need to think about the lack of material resources in the technology, and the economic and political. But on the other hand, if we don't have the people engaged in understanding these issues, we will not create equitable conditions for people to participate, for people to fight injustice and so forth. I'm thinking particularly when Chris talks, when Maha talks, when Laura brings in this issue, I'm fascinated by how, or rather kind of depressed by how in the United States at this time, it is so unfashionable to talk about power on a global scale. It is as if all of us need to pretend that this country is doing good for all of humanity, and those of us who say things like, you use even the terms like colonialism or post-colonialism or militarism, sound like we are conspiracy theorists. How have people and systems managed to push us critical thinkers talking about these basic things of fact that are happening right now around the world, describing these? I'm reminded of the quote by George Orwell, who said, in times of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And I feel like describing those simple things like existential or colonial or militarism, to me, after living in this country for almost a decade, sound like, did I just say something so terrible that I have jeopardized my own professional and social career in this country? And I can't believe that, because living under the king, a monarchy in my home country 10, 20 years ago, we were constantly afraid of things, but it wasn't that bad. And I'm thinking, what a paradox that we're not even engaging in these real conversations about people's life and survival, people's security and threat, people's privacy and sovereignty. and we're afraid to use the terms in academic and intellectual conversation. I'm now listening to a national conversation that the industry is going to take over. One of the presidential candidates in the United States is going to completely sell the university system to private corporations. And I'm wondering, wow, how have we evolved into the 21st century as an international community? We have stopped talking about colonial and post-colonial conditions. Wow.
Yeah, I know Maha. Before we heard sort of like a baby noise, she was ready and she had something. And I can't wait for her to get back. But it's sort of we got some questions coming in too.
Yes.
But what I want to do is just make a connection between that, right? The fears, right? And then how do those fears play into our daily classroom?
Yes.
I'm in an environment, right, where they say, why should kids have cell phones? Kids don't need cell phones in the classroom. They're going to be distracted. They're not going to be listening. And you feel like this whole politics of fear, right? Of like, if we give more control to the people, they're not going to listen to us. And you see how on just a micro level that happens, right? And how that creates the idea. And Maha, I believe, talked about this earlier about what's difficult to do. And I think in so many ways we impose our own difficulties onto other people, onto other countries, onto curriculum, onto questions, right? Instead of just struggling through them together. So I just wanted to make that connection, and hopefully Maha comes back. And we do have some other questions. I don't know if you wanted to point them out. Okay.
Laura or Joe, do you want to pick up something or respond to one of the questions? And remember, we were talking about different contexts in which we are thinking about these things. I hope I made sense in terms of the American context of talking about equity and how it is unfunny and unfashionable and wanted that we even talk about issues of access and equity.
But Sam, I'm really interested in what you're saying, because the literature that I read from here has the American press talking about inequality as the #1 problem. So how do you talk about inequality and not talk about power?
No, that's a different kind of inequality. That's economic inequality that has become a political football, but inequality on a global scale. Inequality in terms of nations dominating nations, nations invading nations, or people being marginalized because they look different, right? But these things are not talked about. You can't. You can talk about inequality on a national scale, except for certain groups of people. You can talk in bland terms. You cannot talk in concrete terms. And then you cannot talk about inequality and inequity on transnational and global terms. No. Nobody is interested. They will yawn at you. And so I'm not saying that somebody is actively suppressing or oppressing. It's simply that it is unfashionable. And, it's just, I look around and I think, why haven't these philosophers and English studies scholars and critical theorists and political scientists not been talking about these things? Is it just a deafening silence on the Western Front? And that influences educational issues and technological issues as well.
I think in the South African context, it is a burning issue.
Wow. You should lead. I was saying the other day, it's time to listen to South African scholars once again.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think, and what's mindful of that, and when we talk about like technology in the classroom and how we're going about teaching, is that we not only talk about sort of like this transnational inequality, but we rarely talk about how we are the creators and the maintainers of it, right? Especially in the American context, right? Rarely do we. I'm thinking about the classes I got to teach. Is like I want to get to a point where we can talk about ourselves and the crimes and the consequences of those crimes that we participate in, that we benefit from. And when we talk about technology and equity, and I see a question from Terry about like news and ideas. Yes, we are always filtering, right? And in many ways, we are always filtering news and ideas for our own benefit, so we can be more comfortable with how we live, right? And this happens in classrooms all the time. You talk about how American history is taught. how world history is taught, right? And who's positioned as the quote-unquote winners and losers, right? Nobody's ever, no cultures are just like different, right? It's always a exoticizing or a erasure of some cultures. We're never just equally embraced. So how are we going about breaking those conversations, and how are we using technology to be able to share these stories and these critiques, right? And yeah,
let me just plug in that we will address these issues head on, I think, in the educational and cross-cultural and cross-contextual context perspective in the last session of this series, the EdConteXts on July 27, Maha? Right?
Probably. I don't think we've confirmed the date, but yeah, probably.
Okay. Other questions that we want to pick?
I saw a question on Twitter by Jeffrey Kiefer, and he's saying, I used to be more of a critical theorist, though started to become uncomfortable with some of the perspectives. And I think he's talking more towards, I think he's more of a postmodernist. And it's a very interesting thing, because a lot of people that I know, well, maybe not a lot, but a few people that I know start out being critical and then become more postmodernist. And I think the main thing for me personally is that I think you can have a postmodern sensibilities that doesn't exclude you from being critical, but just makes you realize that you can't follow any grand narratives of empowerment.
Yes.
But you realize that there's a lot of contextual and local ways of being critical within a particular context, and that there's a lot of intersectionality in every context. So like we were saying here, there's some ways in which this is an anti-colonial meeting that we're having right now, but in other ways it's still pretty colonial. And so I think I think you can't stop seeing the different ways of seeing the same thing. It's a bit like quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
Like it can be one thing, and then if you look at it from a different perspective, it's another thing, and they're both true in some sense. And that's also a little bit why it's difficult for some people to understand that, because they have such different perspective. And it is, when we give them our perspective, they're like, "What are you talking about? That's not happening."
And I'm thinking that kind of multi-perspective and dualism, ambiguity, and confusion even is very useful in the academic context. We shouldn't celebrate technology as, oh, this is a game changer, or we should reject it and sit there and complain. Or it's the same thing with these issues about colonialism and other existential issues of where technology comes into place. I'm thinking about the benefits instead of the loss when we dare to go beyond and question power and structure. If there's English studies, somebody said recently that the best gift of English studies is post-colonialism, not the colonial canon. So it just opens up people's minds, and these questioning technology can produce the best discourses about technology, best uses of technology. Questioning power can make use of the best understanding and best education vis-a-vis power and equality in society. So the idea that if we question, we are denying, rejecting, defending, right, that we are Luddites, is just silly, because it just narrows our mind if we don't question things.
Right. And so let me talk about a couple of people who talk practically about Techquity issues. They don't use the term Techquity, but they talk about them quite a lot, and about how you use it in your own classroom. So we've been talking now about, on a global scale, but I'd like to take things down to the classroom level. So Chris Schaffer, who's at Hybrid Pedagogy, and he's giving a course on flipped classroom later this month. But he wrote an article a few months ago called "Homework is a Social Justice Issue." And he talks about, not only from the technology side, but also from the non-tech side, how when you assign homework, you make assumptions about equality among students in the amount of time they'll be able to work on it, the amount of, the kind of concentration they can get at home. And you don't think about, first of all, if you assign things like streaming video for a flipped classroom, you're not taking account of the infrastructure that the students have, the access they have to sitting on a computer. For example, I teach sometimes adult women, and adult women don't have that time. They don't have their own computer, for example, and they have to ask someone to leave the computer so that they can work. And so that becomes a problem. He talks about how some people are in a family where the situation at home is calm and comfortable, and there's no violence or drinking or fighting or whatever, and that allows them to do their homework, versus others who come from, I don't know if they're in an area that's not safe, and this happens here in Egypt as well, or their parents are fighting, or there's all sorts of these circumstances going on. And he talks about how, as teachers, when we assign students to do something at home and then they don't do it or they don't do it well, then we need to question all these things that could be happening at the micro level. For each individual student, it's not really something that you can start your course knowing that you will have these inequalities in your class. You just have to be open to understanding what might be causing inequalities between your students. And so I love that he does that, and he talks about that. And another person, go on.
Did you?
Someone wanted to ask something, right?
Oh, no, go ahead, Maha. You were on a roll.
Okay. And the other person I wanted to talk about is Anne Gagne, who talks a lot about accessibility. And so in how a lot of the stuff that we do online might not be accessible to people who have, for example, who are colorblind or whatever. There are certain, or dyslexic, those disabilities that are not so visible. Like if someone is blind or deaf, it's pretty obvious and pretty well known, and you find a way to deal with it. But the world isn't designed for people who are, for example, dyslexic or colorblind, even though it's actually pretty straightforward to design everything that you do online in a way that addresses them. It's not difficult, it's just that it's not done. And I thought that's another angle to it that usually when we talk about Techquity, we don't think about it in those terms.
Joe, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I did want to say something. I was thinking, as you were talking about colonialism or anti-colonialism, I was thinking about, central to equity conversations where I work is, to me, sometimes we leave out the importance of anti-racism, right? And so, and I also want to think about, a lot of times the optimism or the spirit of inquiry that educators bring to working with digital tools in the classroom, usually for the first time. And so, I want to think with the group about the possibilities and opportunity spaces of open online courses like CL MOOC to engage in questions about, how might these digital tools be tools for anti-racism or anti-colonialism? Because in my experience, new educators new to the profession warm to these questions, and vibrant communities circle around these questions. And I think that, different than like the star professor who's just recording their lectures on YouTube, when we invite a community to really think together and network, they will take up these big questions like, how can these tools be tools for anti-racism and anti-colonialism? And are these open online courses the opportunity space that I think they are?
Yeah. I'm reminded of a particular example recently. Google, the company, started an educator online certification kind of program where it was trying to engage educators, and it first started by claiming that 57,000 people or something like that signed up from around the world. It involved the First Lady of the United States in one of these pitches, and then finally it said there were presenters from 12 countries, and I thought, how did it come down from 57,000 people to people from 12 countries, probably 12 of them? And then turns out there were some 900 something views on the Google Hangout on air. There are 14 colleagues watching us at this time, and I'm thinking that's a pretty interesting proportion here, a ratio. So the claims of access do not translate, sometimes, as you can see, in visible numbers below videos, or those claims beyond the numbers and the technological access itself, they don't make any sense around the world. Because if you listen to that pitch made by one of the facilitators of the Google online seminar series, it was so quintessentially North American concept, and it is so odd to listen to those things and listen to those people assuming that people talk about education in the same terms around the world. Just try the word assignment when you land in 5 different parts of the world and see how it goes. Or the word syllabus, right? I mean, it's fascinating how these fundamental issues of basic terms, fundamental issues of basic epistemological worldviews about learning and teacher-student relationship, all of these things, these existential issues that Laura was talking about, I would even break them down into educational, sociological, political, and economic existential issues. And then the fact that these things do not translate across borders, even when the massive open online courses are available and accessible for everybody. I mean, sometimes I have to wonder who those 50,000 people signing up for the American Star Professors courses around the world are. It could be people like me, who were, even while they are in their home country, in Nepal, India, China, wherever, they're already part of a global elite. If not economically elite, then educationally elite, somehow already connected. And then narrow down that from the 50,000 people in the class, there may be actually, if you look into the actual people engaged from around the world, there may be 200. And of the 200, they'll pick that one guy who brags about how wonderful the course was, and then they'll use that person as a promotional tool. And if that's access, I am sorry, humanity.
Is this a good time for me to pick up on your point, Sam?
Yes.
As you were speaking, it reminded me, I have a colleague who says that you get good cholesterol and you get bad cholesterol, and in the same way you get good diversity and you get bad diversity. And his point is that the kind of diversity that is often flouted and spoken about is the kind of elite diversity. So the kind of global elite that has the cultural capital to engage in these kinds of open online courses. That's the good diversity. That's enriching, but that's actually for those who already have the literacies to have these conversations and who can share a language. Whereas those who don't have those kind of literacies, who don't have the can't afford the kind of access that they might need, don't have the smartphones, that's the much more difficult kind of diversity, and that's the kind that is much less exciting to talk about and to promote and to address.
And also the cultural literacies. Remember there was an article recently published in EdConteXts by my colleague Sharif, If Malala Was My Student, and he'd seen Malala on Jon Stewart, and he was thinking, what if she was my student, and how would that change the way I teach? And then I was thinking about Malala as just an example of a person who got Western attention, and I think she now lives in England or something, but the situation she's in, her bravery, and of course, and I love what she's done with it. But and like she always says, there are hundreds and thousands of girls who are like her, who go through the same thing every day. They go through that risk in order to get educated. And then in a country like Palestine, that's just the way life is. Anybody going out of their home has risks dying, and nobody really focuses on that, you know? And just the person who got the attention, and it's good that she has the literacy to raise awareness about these issues, but it's a much broader issue, and it's not even just about girls, and it's just not just about her country. It's in so many different places in the world that it's risky to go to school. But this, know, the West just hangs on to this one person, and then she becomes like, and I admire her, but there are millions like her that don't get that attention.
It's just scary to even think about that.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And when I think about the sort of like the connections, right, and the things that we can do in these online spaces, and we talk about these sort of like transnational connections, these I guess you could say translingual connections, right, across languages. And it brings me back to this interesting story of I had a student who was struggling in Spanish class, and I think it's an easier class, right? So for anybody who's like willing to do the work, but I just asked him, why do you need to know Spanish? And his response was, so I can get a job, right? And not so that they can, like, we can connect culturally across countries and share in each other's sort of like joys and struggles, but no, I need to know the language so I can get a job, right? And so I was like, first of all, I just asked him, like, do you really believe that? And you could tell, like, in the motivation for learning a new language, right? And what's it all for, right? And when you talk about these stories, like very tragic stories of Palestine and the struggle they're going through from Israel is it's very I always say like the conversation that's happening in equity or Techquity is the balance between or how we make the balance between what's difficult and what's necessary. And in so many ways we always have like let ourselves like, oh, that's too difficult to do, and not long enough have we just said these things are necessary. Anti-racism is necessary. Anti-colonialism is necessary. Anti-imperialism is necessary. And I think I think our work, right, is to really start to spread that through our classrooms and really be subversive about it, because I believe that we will always have to be subversive about it. I don't think that the power structures that are set up today are set up to want to do that on their own. It's something that we will have to do as people.
Yeah, yeah.
And speaking of that, I mean, I'm just going to comment on some things that are happening in the U.S., right? Like the Confederate flag, the fact that, yes, they're going to take it down, or they took it down, but the fact that there's still a few people who didn't want to take it down, that is important. It should have been done like ages ago. I can't believe that it's still there. Yeah, exactly, Chris. And then the Donald Trump, that he would say what he said about Mexicans, and that some people would not be upset about. That's a problem. It's not a problem that 90% of the people are upset about it, or probably less than 90, but anyway.
Oh, he's soaring he's rising in his polls, which is.
It's just crazy. So I think it speaks to what Chris was talking about. Some things are necessary. Some conversations are necessary, and spreading the word about them is necessary. And the power structures are not going to change anytime soon, so we're always going to be struggling for this, but we need to foreground it, I think. And I think just what Chris just said now is just that we don't talk about these things often enough, even if we're talking about them a lot.
On a more optimistic note, though, sometimes I also think that the fact that the person would learn Spanish language in order to get a job is one of the reasons, but I think we have to reinforce the other reasons without worrying too much about that one reason, because like at least the person is learning it, right? I was talking to a colleague in a university in the South here, who said that he's not worried about people paying too much attention to language instead of teaching and learning in the case of international students, because he then can invite people to come learn language and then use as an entry point to actually engage those students about the actual challenges that they have, so that the moment you see an international student, you don't say, oh, you're an international student, you have a language problem. No, actually, I haven't read the article yet. So I was sick, right? So, but at least you get that person's attention. So I guess this technology can also serve the same way. I think we can say, hey, technology, cool, yay, and then see how many people come in. And then we can have the real good conversation. Sometimes I think of it that way. Otherwise, it can be a little depressing.
One thing I'm reminded of, recently the ISTE conference was going on, and I wasn't able to attend. And ISTE certainly serves, its purpose as an organization, and I think, gets appropriate criticism for how vendor-driven it is, and how, though it's a membership organization of educators, it's largely funded by vendors. But during that conference, as the hashtag, was starting to pop through my Twitter feed, a hashtag that did trend was teaching racism, and it was the same time as the Confederate flag was coming down, and this hashtag didn't seem to be generated by educators. In fact, it seemed to be generated by citizens, primarily citizens of color, who just got on a tear about all the ways schools teach racism and promote racism. And to me, I was moved that was trending at the time, where this this conference that does have a tendency to fetishize tools was also going on. And it was, for me, it was a moment of optimism, because I think that the work we do in these open online spaces, and when we invite educators to do production-centered work and write the web, we invite them to start creating channels and authoring conversations that are really important, like that. Like, how are we teaching racism inadvertently?
Exactly. Yeah. It's like during the Arab Spring, a lot of national media, especially TV in the United States, were literally saying that Facebook brought about this revolution. I laughed. It was so awful. But at the same time, I thought, oh, through Facebook, you're at least talking about Egypt at this time, which is great. While talking about Facebook, by the way, while saying that nonsensical thing that Facebook brought about the revolution.
Because we're running low on time, and Jeffrey Kiefer from Twitter is wisely recommending that we kind of wrap up and maybe wrap up with some suggestions for next steps. I wonder if we have any suggestions for next steps.
I want to learn about existential Techquity issues.
Maha, it cut off.
I want Laura to write more about existential
Yes.
issues that she mentioned.
Yes, please.
I'd like to read
Recommendation number 1. I think that we should continue to have these conversations in the classroom, because I taught a course last semester called World Rhetoric, and Maha indirectly contributed to it. And when in the beginning, students were not sure how we could bring these issues of rhetorical traditions and other parts of the world, issues of technology and its connection, and issues of access and in some sense equity. But by the end of the semester, the students were so inspired to actually broaden their horizons. I think our students in any part of the world are interested in broadening their horizons. I don't think we can sit there and complain about the systems of societies or the lack of interest or an active suppression of discourses that promote equity and equality. So I guess students, go to your students, do in ways that are digestible in small doses, in ways that will inspire them, because they want this next generation. I'm hopeful about our students, and I think we should really start with the students and continue with the students.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think there's I think history can really help us, because when we use that term new technologies, right, we don't talk about how they are used in the same old ways. It's not a different mindset that well, and some people are using different mindsets, but overall, it feels the same sort of economic implications that are happening with our technologies, and how people are always fighting against that. So Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States, is a great way to get deeper into the story that is America. Vijay Prashad, History of the World South. It's a better title for it. I'll try to share it if I can. And just to really start to realize that we're all connected in the struggle to, liberate ourselves and live more joyful lives, more human lives, and not just economic productivity. So I think that's important for me, and I think about the goals that I want to bring to the classroom. It is about that, and I think equity starts from there.
Revisit and review history with your students.
Yes,
right?
definitely.
Yeah. And think about justice a little more. Yeah. Still waiting.
Laura, any last word from you?
Yeah, I think this kind of values-laden advocacy around technology is really important. I think the notions that we've mentioned or touched on around the affordances, we have to be really careful of, and I think it's really important to keep these kinds of discussions around the values that we afford the technologies is a really important strategic advocacy role that we have to keep on playing.
Yeah, so it is my pleasure to thank everyone for this awesome conversation, and I'm sad to bring the conversation to a close. But thanks, everybody. There will be a full video recording of this webinar available immediately on www.connectedlearning.tv with other curated content on the way that you can share with your networks. So this wraps up the first webinar of this July 2015 series spotlighting themes and questions related to CL MOOC. Let's see. Me and this fabulous outro. If you found this conversation helpful, please share it with your networks, and if you'd like to know more about upcoming webinars from Connected Learning TV in 2015, please visit www.connectedlearning.tv and sign up for the email newsletter. Thanks again, everyone. We hope to see you online and in spaces, of course, like CL. It's not too late to join in there with the Making, Connecting, and Learning. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for everybody for watching this.
Thank you.